before its war with Iran began, were gone. Almost 80% of a separate missile defense system, the kind designed to stop the world's most advanced ballistic threats, had been fired away. Somewhere on the other side of the planet, in Beijing, analysts were reportedly watching those same numbers, because for the first time in decades, the question was no longer whether America could win a war. It was whether America could still fight more than one at a time. This is the story of how a single superpower found itself pulled in three directions at once, and why the leaders in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran now believe the door that has been locked for 80 years might finally be opening. To understand why the summer of 2026 felt so different, it helps to go back to a number that used to define American power. During the 1980s, the United States spent between 5 and 6% of its entire economic output on defense, enough to plan for what strategists called a 2.5 war doctrine. The ability to fight two major regional wars simultaneously while still holding the line against a smaller crisis somewhere else. That posture was expensive, but it was also the backbone of American deterrence for half a century. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the calculus changed. Washington and its allies began drawing down what became known as the peace dividend, and defense spending as a share of the economy fell steadily for the next 3 decades, landing at roughly 3% of GDP by the end of the 2010s, and even lower toward the close of the following decade. The military did not disappear. It simply became leaner, more precise, and built around the assumption that America would rarely, if ever, need to fight more than one serious war at a time. That assumption is now being tested in real time in 3 theaters simultaneously, and the strain is visible in the most literal way a military can show strain: its ammunition shelves. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the United States entered its confrontation with Iran with an estimated 2,200 of its most modern Patriot interceptors and 452 THAAD interceptors, a missile defense system built specifically to shoot down the kind of long-range ballistic missiles that Iran, and potentially North Korea or China, could someday launch. By the time a ceasefire briefly took hold in April 2026, roughly half the Patriot stockpile was gone. When fighting resumed later that summer, the numbers kept falling, with independent estimates from CSIS and confirmed by multiple U.S. officials placing the remaining Patriot inventory somewhere between 759 and 827, and the THAAD stockpile down to as few as 232 interceptors at points during the conflict, a drop of well over half in a matter of months. Tomahawk cruise missiles, the workhorse of American long-range strikes, had also been depleted by close to a third. The Pentagon publicly insisted its forces had, in the words of Chief Spokesman Sean Parnell, everything it needs to execute at the time and place of the president's choosing. But multiple sources briefed on internal Pentagon inventory reports told CNN the stockpiles were, in blunt military language, dangerously low. The reason those numbers matter goes far beyond one war in the Middle East. Patriot and THAAD interceptors are not something a factory can produce overnight. Analysts point out that the United States manufactures roughly 600 Patriot missiles a year, and each interceptor takes a complex chain of specialized components and skilled labor to build. CSIS estimated it could take 3 years or more just to rebuild the THAAD inventory back to where it stood before the Iran war began. That lag is precisely what worries strategists most, because it means a choice made in one region can leave the country exposed in another for years afterward, long after the headlines have moved on. And it is exactly the kind of vulnerability that a rival power does not need to attack directly to exploit. It only needs to watch and wait. Which brings the story to the second front nobody in Washington ever stopped watching: Taiwan. Since 2020, Chinese military aircraft have flown into Taiwan's air defense identification zone with increasing frequency. And by September 2023, those incursions had already hit a single-day record of over 100 sorties. But something changed in January 2026 when, according to Brookings Institution researchers, a Chinese military drone crossed directly into Taiwanese airspace for the first time in the conflict's history, a deliberate escalation beyond the ambiguous gray zone tactics Beijing had relied on for years. Chinese state media frames these actions as routine defense of sovereign territory. Taiwanese officials, Hazard, described them as a coordinated pressure campaign designed to exhaust the island's military readiness and convince its 23 million people that resistance is ultimately futile. Both explanations can be true at once, and that is precisely the strategic ambiguity Beijing has cultivated. Enough plausible deniability to avoid triggering a direct American response, enough consistent pressure to erode Taiwan's defenses year after year. Most intelligence assessments still hold that China is not fully prepared to attempt an invasion before 2027, but the Gray Zone campaign does not require an invasion to succeed. It only requires patience, and every American interceptor fired in the Middle East is one fewer that would be available in the Pacific if patience ever ran out. Before turning to the second front, it is worth understanding exactly how the United States arrived at this particular squeeze in the Middle East, because the timeline itself is part of the evidence. In June 2025, the United States struck Iranian nuclear facilities directly, a dramatic escalation that Iran answered with what one contemporaneous report described as a performative R, a retaliatory strike against the American base at Al Udeid in Qatar, one that nonetheless required the U.S. military to fire close to 30 Patriot interceptors in a single engagement just to knock down Iran's incoming missiles. That single exchange, according to people familiar with the Pentagon's internal munitions tracker, cited in reporting from The Guardian, pushed already strained Patriot stockpiles below the minimum floor the Joint Chiefs of Staff require to execute existing war plans, a floor that reporting indicates had actually been breached years earlier, during the extended period of American military aid to Ukraine, but had not previously become a matter of public record. When hostilities with Iran resumed and intensified through the spring and summer of 2026, that already thin cushion collapsed further, and the ceasefire that briefly took hold in April proved fragile, precisely because neither side had reason to believe the underlying dispute, primarily Iran's continued uranium enrichment capacity, had actually been resolved. By August 2026, with a durable settlement still elusive, CSIS researchers were warning explicitly that diminished interceptor stockpiles could force American and Allied commanders to take greater risks with future interceptions, launching fewer missiles at each incoming threat to conserve what remains, a trade-off that raises the odds of a lethal strike getting through. 9 time zones to the northwest, a third front had already been grinding on for more than 4 years. By early August 2026, the front line in Ukraine stretched for roughly 1,000 kilometers and had barely moved in months. Russian forces, after finally capturing the strategic cities of Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad in early 2026, following more than a year of siege warfare, failed to convert that breakthrough into any further advance. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Russian troops gained fewer than 38 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory in the entire month of July 2026, an area smaller than Manhattan, despite what analysts describe as Moscow's costliest offensive push of the year. Diplomatic efforts have produced motion without resolution. Trilateral talks in Geneva in February 2026 put the question of territory on the table for the first time. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signaled a willingness to compromise short of ceding sovereignty. And by June, Britain, France, and Germany had issued a joint statement backing direct dialogue on the condition that any settlement be coordinated with Europe. Moscow rejected those conditions within days. A fragile 32-hour Easter truce in April, proposed by Zelensky and accepted by Vladimir Putin, saw Ukraine report 469 separate violations, mostly drone strikes, before the ceasefire had even fully expired. The war has not ended. It has simply changed shape, becoming a contest of drones, energy infrastructure, and the patience of each side's foreign backers rather than sweeping troop movements across open ground. Here is where the 3 stories start to intersect, and where the real substance of the opportunity that Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran may see begins to take shape. Every Patriot interceptor sent to defend Israel or American bases in the Middle East is an interceptor that cannot be sent to Ukraine. According to reporting from The Guardian and later confirmed by multiple outlets including CNN and Asia Times, the Trump administration paused a transfer of munitions to Ukraine in the summer of 2025, specifically because Pentagon inventory trackers showed critical stockpiles had fallen below the minimum threshold required for the U.S. military's own war plans. President Trump has publicly told Ukrainian officials, according to reporting from Asia Times, that Patriot interceptors could not be spared for Kyiv because, in his words, we need them for ourselves. Reports based on internal Pentagon data indicate that U.S. forces have fired more than 300 ATACMS long-range missiles since early 2026 alone, leaving that particular stockpile, according to multiple defense analysts, at what one report bluntly called virtually zero. Global demand for Patriot interceptors, factoring in requests from Ukraine, Taiwan, Israel, and other partners, now reportedly represents a backlog of more than 4,300 rounds, or roughly 7 years of production at prior manufacturing rates. This is the mechanism strategists mean when they use the word overstretch, and it is worth pausing to understand precisely what that word does and does not mean. It does not mean the United States military is weak. By nearly every measure of raw capability, aircraft carriers, stealth aircraft, nuclear submarines, satellite networks, it remains the most powerful conventional force on Earth. What overstretch means is narrower and more mechanical than that. It means the rate at which the U.S. can produce and replace its most sophisticated weapons has fallen behind the rate at which it may need to use them if serious crises in multiple regions occurred close together. Mark Canchin, a senior advisor at CSIS, put it plainly when he told Fox News that depleted munition stockpiles were a major reason for the suspension of American air operations against Iran, adding in his assessment that such a shortfall might encourage China to do something. That single sentence captures the entire strategic anxiety driving the story. It is not that adversaries believe they could defeat the United States outright. It is that they may believe the United States, faced with a genuine crisis in 2 or 3 places simultaneously, would be forced to choose which ally to abandon, and that the choosing itself would be a kind of victory for whoever forced it. There is a version of history that helps explain why this scenario feels so uniquely dangerous to American strategists in 2026, and it goes back to a Cold War concept called horizontal escalation. During the 1980s, American war planners assumed that if the Soviet Union attacked in one region, it might deliberately open a second front elsewhere specifically to divide American attention and resources. The doctrine was designed to prevent exactly that, to make clear that America could fight in multiple places at once, so no adversary would ever be tempted to try. What is different about 2026 is not the theory. It is the fact that, for the first time since that doctrine was written, the underlying arithmetic of stockpiles and production capacity no longer clearly backs it up. And crucially, the scenario would not require any secret alliance or formal pact between Russia, China, and Iran. It would only require each of them, watching the same headlines and the same Pentagon budget documents that are now publicly available, to independently conclude that the moment favors action rather than restraint. That is precisely the finding at the center of a newly published report examining what its authors call an axis of aggressors, a term now used by some U.S. officials and defense analysts to describe the deepening, though still informal, cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. According to Fox News Digital's reporting on the study, researchers documented 616 separate instances of security cooperation among the 4 countries, ranging from weapons transfers to intelligence sharing to joint military exercises. Retired Air Force Lieutenant General Richard Newton told Fox News the danger stems not just from each country modernizing its own military across air, sea, land, space, and cyber domains, but from the increasing degree to which their governments are coordinating with one another. Mark Montgomery, a retired Rear Admiral and senior fellow who has studied the alignment extensively, told Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that the longer any single crisis entangles the United States, whether in Ukraine or in Iran, the more it benefits China and Russia specifically, regardless of whether those 2 countries had any hand in starting that crisis. His research has also traced a more concrete link: Chinese-made microelectronics, many of them technically dual-use components exported for ostensibly civilian purposes, flowing into both Iranian missile production and Russian weapons programs, a supply chain that makes sanctions extraordinarily difficult to enforce because the same component can cross from a legitimate commercial buyer to a battlefield weapon system with little traceable evidence of intent. Not every expert agrees on how deep or deliberate this alignment actually is, and that disagreement matters because it shapes how seriously policymakers should treat the threat. Time magazine's reporting on U.S. intelligence assessments found a striking reversal. Earlier intelligence community analysis had predicted the pattern of Russian and Chinese behavior during the Iran war with some accuracy, describing a loosely coordinated response among adversaries, only for the 2026 edition of a major annual threat assessment to walk that framework back, concluding that the very idea of deep adversary alignment overstated how much genuine coordination was actually occurring between the 4 countries. In other words, even inside the U.S. government, there is active or unresolved debate about whether Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang are executing anything resembling a coordinated strategy, or whether each capital is simply pursuing its own separate interests and happening to benefit, almost by accident, whenever American resources are pulled toward any one of the others. Both interpretations lead to a similar practical conclusion for U.S. war planners, but they carry very different implications for how the crisis should be addressed diplomatically. A genuine 4-way alliance would call for a coordinated global counter-strategy. A set of separate actors, each opportunistically exploiting American distraction, calls for something closer to old-fashioned regional deterrence, rebuilt theater by theater. What is not in dispute is the reaction inside Washington itself, which has shifted from quiet concern to public urgency over the course of a single year. The Pentagon's own budget requests for the next fiscal cycle reflect the scale of the problem it now acknowledges. According to reporting reviewed by Fox News, the administration's proposed spending on precision strike missiles is up 245%, funding for THAAD interceptors is up 650%, and funding specifically for the Patriot missile segment enhancement variant is up an extraordinary 927% compared to prior levels. Republican Congressman Troy Niels of Texas summarized the political mood bluntly, telling reporters that
If it takes $1.5 trillion in defense spending to keep munitions available, I'm all in. Yet even bipartisan enthusiasm for spending cannot solve the more stubborn half of the problem, which is not money but time. Missile interceptors require rare components, specialized rocket motors, and skilled technicians who cannot be trained overnight. And defense analysts told CNN that current delivery schedules amount to roughly 15 new Tomahawks and 20 new Patriot missiles arriving each month, a pace that will take years to meaningfully close the gap that opened during just a few months of intense fighting. There is also a quieter, less visible dimension to this story that rarely makes headlines, but shapes everything above it: the industrial base itself. Modern interceptors like the Patriot's PAC-3 variant and the THAAD system are not assembled from off-the-shelf parts. They depend on specialized rocket motors, seeker components, and guidance electronics produced by a small handful of suppliers, several of which experienced their own production bottlenecks even before the current crisis began. The Pentagon has responded by pressing defense contractors to expand manufacturing capacity, and reporting from CNBC and CNN indicates the department signed at least 2 new agreements in August 2026, specifically aimed at boosting Patriot and THAAD rocket motor production. But expanding a missile factory is not like expanding a car factory. It requires new tooling, additional certified technicians, and in many cases entirely new supplier relationships that can take years, not months, to mature into reliable output. That lag is the quiet arithmetic sitting underneath every public reassurance from Pentagon spokespeople that America's arsenal remains, in their words, in very good shape. This is the strategic bind now facing American allies from Warsaw to Taipei, and it explains a shift in U.S. policy that has drawn far more attention than the underlying arithmetic behind it. Rather than simply expanding its own production, the current administration has pushed allies in both Europe and Asia to dramatically increase their own defense spending and, in effect, share more of the burden of deterrence that Washington has carried largely alone since the end of the Cold War. That pressure campaign has been publicly visible within NATO, and administration officials have delivered a similar message to Asian partners, urging Japan, South Korea, and others to build more self-sufficient modern militaries rather than relying primarily on American guarantees. The logic is straightforward. If the United States cannot easily fight in 3 places simultaneously, then reducing the number of places where it might have to fight alone is itself a form of solving the overstretch problem. But building modern, self-sufficient militaries from a standing start takes years, sometimes a decade or more of sustained investment. And in the short term, many of these allies remain exactly as dependent on American stockpiles as they were before the pressure campaign began. So what happens next depends less on any single battlefield and more on timing, a variable no single government fully controls. If the war in Ukraine settles into a genuine, lasting ceasefire, if the confrontation with Iran cools into a stable, if uneasy, standoff, and if China continues to judge that 2027 remains too early to risk a direct move on Taiwan, then the overstretch of 2026 may end up remembered as a dangerous scare rather than a turning point. A moment when American planners were forced to confront a vulnerability and, over the following several years, methodically closed it through expanded production and burden sharing with allies. But if any 2 of those 3 fronts flare simultaneously, a renewed Iranian escalation timed alongside an intensified Chinese pressure campaign on Taiwan, for instance, the United States would be forced into exactly the choice its own war planners have spent the better part of a year publicly worrying about: which ally receives the last interceptors on the shelf and which one is asked to wait. Defense analysts are explicit that there are no easy substitutes if that moment arrives. Naval destroyers equipped with standard missiles can intercept some ballistic threats, but, as the authors of the CSIS report bluntly noted, those ships are generally too far away to help in time, and there is currently no equivalent replacement for the kind of layered ground-based defense that Patriot and THAAD systems provide. None of this guarantees that China, Russia, or Iran will act simply because an opportunity exists. Nations rarely make decisions of that magnitude on inventory numbers alone, and each of the 3 faces its own serious internal constraints, from Russia's staggering casualty rates and economic strain after 4.5 years of war, to Iran's uncertain domestic stability following a change in supreme leadership in March 2026, to China's own concerns about the economic and diplomatic costs of a Taiwan operation that could unite much of the world against it. What has genuinely changed is not the likelihood of any single crisis, but the mathematics behind America's ability to respond to more than one at once. For 80 years, the credibility of American deterrence rested partly on a simple, largely unspoken assumption that no rival could safely assume the United States would run out of the tools needed to respond. In the summer of 2026, for the first time since the Cold War, that assumption is being tested in public, in congressional budget hearings, in Pentagon inventory leaks, and in the open acknowledgement of America's own senior defense officials that the shelf is not as full as it once was,
Whether that test ends in a rebuilt arsenal and a renewed deterrent, or in a moment when three separate ambitions converge on a single overstretched superpower, may end up being the defining strategic question of the decade. And right now, nobody, not in Washington, not in Beijing, not in Moscow, and not in Tehran, knows for certain how it ends.